The church bells fell silent as the hour passed. Catherine stood motionless at the altar, the delicate lace of her veil unable to hide the growing panic in her eyes. James never arrived. The man who had promised her forever had vanished without a trace on what should have been the most beautiful day of their lives. It was June 7th, 1982, and in that moment a 40-year mystery began. It was late afternoon when the whispers started. "He's just running late," they said at first. Then there must have been an accident. By evening, as Catherine sat still wearing her wedding dress in her parents' living room, police officers were taking statements. James Mitchell, 28, successful architect, beloved son and devoted fiancé, had disappeared without a trace. His car was found abandoned at Wickham Bridge, keys still in the ignition, his wedding suit jacket neatly folded on the passenger seat. No note, no blood, no signs of struggle, just absence. Catherine and James had met 3 years earlier at a mutual friends gallery opening. She was finishing her master's in literature. He was designing his first major building. Their connection was immediate and profound. "It was like finding a piece of myself I didn't know was missing," Catherine would later tell investigators. Their relationship blossomed quickly, weekend trips to the coast, long discussions about books and buildings over wine, planning a future that seemed certain. James proposed on Christmas Eve 1981 with a vintage emerald ring that had belonged to his grandmother. "I want to build a life with you," he had said, "something that will last forever." The search for James consumed everything. Catherine's academic career was put on hold as she joined search parties that combed the woods near Wickham Bridge. James's parents, Robert and Eleanor Mitchell, offered a substantial reward for information. Police investigated every angle. Was there another woman? Financial troubles, cold feet, nothing substantial emerged. James's bank accounts showed normal activity until the day before the wedding, when he withdrew $200, presumably for the honeymoon they had planned in Cape Cod. His passport remained in his apartment. His friends were as baffled as everyone else. 6 months passed, with no leads. The detective assigned to the case, Thomas Lawson, began to suggest what others had whispered from the beginning. Perhaps James had simply run away. "Sometimes people just break," he told Catherine gently. "The pressure of commitment, of expectations." But she wouldn't hear it. "You didn't know him," she insisted. "James wouldn't do that to me. Something happened to him." A year after the disappearance, the first true search ended. Police formally classified James as a missing person, but active investigation ceased. Life tried to resume its rhythm. Catherine finally returned to her studies, completing her master's thesis, though her original topic on romantic imagery in Victorian literature had been abandoned for an analysis of absence and grief in modern fiction. Robert Mitchell suffered a mild heart attack, aged beyond his years by the strain of losing his only son. Eleanor took to visiting psychics, desperate for any connection. On the second anniversary of James's disappearance, Catherine finally packed away her wedding dress, still unworn, into a cedar chest in her parents' attic. "It felt like burying him," she would later write, "but without a body, without answers, grief has no natural conclusion." 5 years passed. Catherine accepted a teaching position at the local college. She dated occasionally, but nothing serious developed. "There was always a ghost between us," one boyfriend complained before ending things. She maintained close contact with the Mitchells, Sunday dinners becoming a ritual that sustained them all. They never spoke of James in the past tense. The years stretched into a decade. Robert Mitchell died in 1992, never knowing what happened to his son. At his funeral, many noted that he had kept James's childhood bedroom exactly as it had been, a shrine to arrested time. Catherine helped Eleanor sort through Robert's belongings afterward, both women moving silently through rooms heavy with absence. "The not knowing is worse than death," Eleanor confided. "Death has rituals, closure. This is like living in suspended animation." In 1996, 14 years after the disappearance, the first potential lead emerged. A former classmate of James claimed to have seen someone resembling him at an architectural conference in Toronto. Detective Lawson, now nearing retirement, reopened the file briefly. The lead proved false. The man in question was indeed an architect from Boston who bore a striking resemblance to James, but was demonstrably not him. Catherine turned 40 on a rainy April day in 1997. She had built a life for herself, respected professor, published author, devoted friend. She had never married, though not for lack of opportunities. "I'm not waiting for James," she told her closest friend Diane. "I just never found anyone who made me feel like taking that particular risk again." But the milestone birthday brought unexpected pain. "I realized I've now lived longer without him than with him," she wrote in her journal. "And yet his absence still defines me in ways I can't escape." 20 years after the disappearance, Eleanor Mitchell died peacefully in her sleep. Catherine, named executor of the estate, began the painful process of sorting through the Mitchell family home. It was a Georgian revival that James had always admired, with its sweeping staircase and intricate mouldings. "When we're old," he had once told Catherine, "we'll live here, and I'll restore every inch of it." Now, Catherine walked through empty rooms, echoing with promises never kept. It was during this process, in the sweltering August heat of 2002, that Catherine made a discovery that would change everything. In the attic, behind a false panel in an antique desk that had belonged to James's grandfather, she found a small, leather-bound journal. The handwriting was unmistakable. James had always formed his letters with an architect's precision. The journal was dated beginning 6 months before their wedding and continued until 2 days before his disappearance. What Catherine read shattered the narrative she had constructed over 20 years. The entries revealed a man increasingly trapped by his own life, suffocating under expectations. "I design buildings with multiple exits," one entry read, "yet I've constructed a life with none." Another, more damning. "Kay deserves someone who wants this life. I keep waiting to want it too, but the wanting doesn't come." The final entries detailed an elaborate plan, a fabricated disappearance, a new identity prepared months in advance, a life waiting in Vancouver, where nobody knew James Mitchell, where he could reinvent himself completely. "This will hurt her beyond measure," he had written, "but a lifetime of living a lie would hurt her more. Better a clean break than a slow poison." The journal ended with an address, an apparent dead drop, where James had arranged to collect new identification documents. Catherine sat motionless as darkness fell around her, the journal open in her lap, 20 years of grief transforming into something else entirely. The following morning, Catherine called Detective Lawson, now long retired. "He left," she said simply when he answered. "He planned it all." Lawson came immediately, reading the journal with increasing dismay. "We could reopen the case," he offered. "This is evidence of identity fraud, at minimum." Catherine considered this as she looked around the house that had held so many ghosts for so long. "What would be the point?" she finally asked. "Finding him now, dragging him back? It's far too late." She closed the journal. "He's had 20 years of the freedom he wanted. I've had 20 years of waiting for answers. Now we both have what we sought." In the weeks that followed, Catherine methodically investigated the trail James had left. The address in the journal led to an abandoned mail service. Records showed it had closed in 1985. The new identity James had arranged, a man named Andrew Winters, appeared in Canadian records until 1987, then vanished. Either James had assumed yet another identity, or he had truly disappeared this time. Catherine never attempted to find him. Instead, she finally held the funeral that had been impossible for 20 years. A simple headstone was placed in the cemetery beside Robert and Eleanor. James Mitchell, beloved son, 1954-1982. The date of death was the day he chose to disappear. In a way, the man I knew did die that day, Catherine explained to Diane. Whoever he became afterward is someone else entirely. The revelation changed Catherine, though not in ways her friends had feared. There was a new lightness to her, a burden lifted. She sold her house and spent a year traveling through Europe, visiting the architectural wonders James had always dreamed of seeing. She wrote a memoir that, while never explicitly mentioning James, explored themes of identity, absence, and reinvention. On what would have been their 25th wedding anniversary, Catherine sat alone on the bench near Wickham Bridge, where James's car had been found. The sunset painted the water in shades of amber and gold. She opened the journal one last time, reading the final entry. Some people are born to build permanence, others are meant for flight. I've pretended to be the former for too long. Maybe someday she'll understand that this isn't about her at all. It's about the impossibility of becoming someone I was never meant to be. Catherine closed the book and stood. With a single fluid motion, she tossed the journal into the current below, watching as the water carried away the last physical evidence of James's deception. I understand now, she whispered to the fading light, but understanding doesn't mean I forgive you. It was too late for forgiveness, too late for reconciliation, too late for anything but acceptance. 30 years passed since James Mitchell walked away from his own wedding. Catherine retired from teaching in 2012, moving to a small coastal cottage where she continued to write and mentor young authors. She never married, but found companionship with a fellow professor who understood that there were parts of her heart permanently marked occupied. Life settled into a gentle rhythm of morning walks along the shore, afternoon writing sessions, evenings spent with good books and better wine. In 2019, an envelope arrived with no return address. Inside was a newspaper clipping about Catherine's latest book winning a prestigious award. A single line was written on the margin: "You deserved better. I'm sorry it was me who taught you that lesson." There was no signature, but Catherine didn't need one. After all these years, she recognized the precise architectural handwriting instantly. She burned the clipping that night in her fireplace, watching the paper curl and blacken until it was unrecognizable. Some ghosts, she had learned, never stop haunting you. The best you can do is acknowledge their presence and continue living anyway. What Catherine couldn't know, would never know, was that James Mitchell, living as Richard Collins, had suffered his own consequences. His architectural career, rebuilt under his new identity, had been successful but never brilliant. He had married twice. Both relationships had ended when his wives sensed the fundamental dishonesty at his core, the parts of himself he kept locked away. He had children who knew nothing of his former life, nothing of the woman in white who had waited at an altar, nothing of the elaborate lie that had formed the foundation of their existence. In his darkest moments, usually after too many drinks, James would search for Catherine online, tracking her career, her publications, the life she had built from the wreckage he left behind. In her success, her apparent happiness, he found both relief and a peculiar kind of pain. She had survived him, thrived without him. The dramatic tragedy he had imagined for her, the abandoned bride forever defined by his absence, had not materialized. Instead, Catherine had become more fully herself, while James had spent 40 years running from who he was. James died in January 2022, never having revealed his true identity to anyone. A heart attack took him quickly as he walked along the Vancouver shoreline he had fled to all those years ago. The obituary listed him as Richard Collins, noted architect, father, grandfather. No mention of the life abandoned, the woman left waiting, the elaborate deception that had defined his existence more completely than any accomplishment that followed. Catherine learned of his death by chance. One of her former students, now an architectural journalist, sent her a link to an article about Richard Collins's contributions to sustainable design. "Reminded me of those stories you used to tell about your architect fiancé," the email read. Funny coincidence. This Collins guy even looked a bit like him based on that old photo on your desk. The article included a recent photograph. James at 68. Grey-haired, distinguished, his eyes still holding that same intensity Catherine remembered. She would have known him anywhere, despite the years, despite the different name beneath the image. Some recognitions transcend time, logic, even betrayal. Catherine printed the article and added it to a box of mementos she kept from that earlier life. Engagement photos, the emerald ring she had never returned, ticket stubs from concerts they had attended together. Not as a shrine, but as acknowledgement. These things had happened, that younger Catherine had existed, the pain had been real, and so had the love, however insufficient it had proven to be. That night, Catherine dreamed of the church, of standing at the altar in her never-worn dress. But in the dream, when the doors opened, James walked through them. He came to her, took her hands, and simply said, "I'm sorry I couldn't be who you needed." And Catherine, with the wisdom of her 70 years, replied, "I'm sorry I couldn't see who you actually were." She woke with tears on her cheeks, but a curious peace in her heart. 40 years of mystery had finally found its conclusion. The man who had disappeared on their wedding day was truly gone now. There would be no more wondering, no more phantom sightings, no more ambiguous notes or clippings. The story had ended. Would she have preferred a different ending? Once, perhaps. The younger Catherine would have wanted dramatic revelations, tearful reunions, the fairy tale redemption. But the woman who had lived 40 years in the aftermath wanted something else entirely. The simple truth. And now she had it, in all its complicated, mundane reality. James hadn't been kidnapped or murdered or trapped in amnesia. He had simply chosen another life, another self, another future than the one they had planned together. Catherine went to her desk and began to write. Not about James this time, not about abandonment or betrayal or the mystery of his disappearance. Instead, she wrote about the freedom that comes from finally letting go of unanswerable questions. About building a life in the spaces left by absence. About the strength found not in happily ever afters, but in surviving their impossibility. She wrote through the night and into the dawn, pages accumulating like years, words flowing like time itself. When she finally stopped, the sun was rising over the ocean, painting her small cottage in golden light. Catherine made a cup of tea and walked to the shoreline, watching the endless rhythm of waves arriving and retreating. It was always too late, she whispered to the horizon, where sea met sky in a seamless line. From the moment you decided to go, from the moment I decided to wait, we were always living in the aftermath. But the aftermath, she had learned over 40 years, was still life, still filled with possibility, with beauty, with connections both fleeting and enduring. The great tragedy wasn't that James had left. It was that he had never discovered what Catherine eventually did, that running from yourself is the one journey guaranteed to fail. As the sun climbed higher, Catherine turned back toward her cottage, toward the manuscript waiting on her desk, toward the day unfolding before her. The past was finally, truly past. What remained was the present moment, and all the moments still to come. It was enough. After 40 years, it was finally enough. The story of Catherine and James, of the bride left waiting and the groom who vanished, became something of a local legend over the years. Young couples visiting the old church would sometimes leave flowers at the threshold, a superstitious ward against similar fate. Catherine's memoir, while never explicitly about James, resonated with readers who recognized the universal experience of surviving abandonment, of rebuilding after betrayal. What no one could have anticipated was how the story would continue after both principal players had exited the stage. In 2023, a year after James's death as Richard Collins, a young woman named Eliza Collins contacted Catherine through her publisher. "I believe you knew my father," the message read, "before he was my father." Catherine agreed to meet her at a cafe near the college where she had taught for so many years. Eliza was 35, with her father's intense eyes and precise way of speaking. She carried a folder of documents, birth certificates, photographs, letters. After Dad died, she explained, I found a locked box in his office. Inside was evidence of his former life. Your name was mentioned several times. For hours, the two women pieced together the fractured narrative of the man they had both known in entirely different contexts. Catherine learned that James had married Eliza's mother in 1986, 4 years after his disappearance, that he had been a dedicated if somewhat remote father, that he had suffered from depression throughout his life, carefully hidden from colleagues and often from family. He used to stand at windows for hours, staring at nothing, Eliza recalled. Mom always said he was thinking about buildings, but I knew it was something else, something missing. Catherine shared her own pieces of the story, the early romance, the elaborate disappearance, the decades of wandering. Together they constructed a more complete portrait of James Mitchell Richard Collins than either had possessed alone. Did he ever mention me? Catherine finally asked, hating the vulnerability in her voice even after all these years. Eliza hesitated. Not directly, but there was a photograph in the box, you in your graduation gown. On the back, he had written, "The life I couldn't face." Catherine closed her eyes briefly. That's both incredibly selfish and strangely honest, she finally said, very much like him. I'm not here to defend him, Eliza said quietly. What he did to you was unforgivable, but I thought you deserved to know that he never really escaped. Whatever he was running from, it followed him. He built a good life in many ways, but there was always something incomplete, missing. Before they parted, Eliza handed Catherine a small package. He left this with specific instructions that it should go to you if I ever discovered the truth. I haven't opened it. Alone that evening, Catherine unwrapped the package with trembling fingers. Inside was the antique emerald ring he had proposed with, the one she had left in his apartment all those years ago, unable to face returning it to his parents. With it was a single sheet of paper, dated just months before his death. Catherine, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you finally have the answers you deserved 40 years ago. I could offer explanations. My father's controlling nature, my own cowardice, the panic that consumed me as our wedding approached, but explanations aren't the same as excuses. There are none adequate for what I did to you. I've followed your life from afar. Your books sit on my shelves. I've read every interview, seen every photograph. The success you've achieved, the wisdom in your words, the lives you've touched, all of it exists because you survived what I did to you. I find myself selfishly grateful that my greatest failure contributed to your greatest strengths, though I know that's little consolation. The ring enclosed belongs to you. It always did. I couldn't bear to sell it, nor could I give it to anyone else. It represents the best version of myself, the man who loved you truly, even if that love wasn't strong enough to overcome my fears. It is far, far too late to ask forgiveness. I don't expect or deserve it, but I wanted you to know that while I escaped our future, I never escaped our past. It has lived within me, a constant reminder of the moment when I chose fear over love, flight over commitment, the unknown over the certainty of your goodness. In another life, we grow old together in my parents' house. In another life, I find the courage to be the man you deserved. In this life, all I can offer is the truth you've sought for so long. I left because I couldn't face the person I would need to become to be worthy of you. With eternal regret, James. Catherine sat with the letter until dawn, the emerald ring catching occasional glints of lamplight. When morning came, she walked to her garden and buried the ring beneath a young oak tree she had planted the previous spring. Not as a monument to what was lost, but as an acknowledgement that some things must be returned to the earth before new growth can begin. In the months that followed, Catherine and Eliza developed an unexpected friendship. There was something healing for both in their connection. Eliza, gaining insight into the father who had always seemed partially absent, even when physically present. Catherine, finding a link to the future that had been stolen from her, a glimpse of how life might have unfolded in that alternate timeline. For Catherine's 72nd birthday, Eliza and her young daughter visited the coastal cottage. 3 generations of women, linked by a man who was simultaneously present and absent in all their lives. As they walked along the shore, Catherine watched Eliza's daughter collecting shells, her movements unconsciously echoing James's precise, deliberate gestures. "Do you think he ever found peace?" Eliza asked suddenly. Catherine considered the question carefully. "I don't know. I hope so. In moments at least. But peace requires acceptance of yourself, and James spent his entire life running from who he was. That makes true peace difficult. And you?" Eliza's eyes were so much like her father's, it was sometimes disorienting. "Did you find peace?" Catherine watched the waves a moment before answering. "Not immediately, not easily, but eventually, yes. I had to learn that closure doesn't always come in the forms we expect. Sometimes it's not about answers or apologies or even understanding. Sometimes it's just about continuing to live fully despite the unanswered questions." Later that evening, as they shared dinner in Catherine's small kitchen, Eliza raised her glass. "To the strange workings of fate," she said, "that turned tragedy into connection." Catherine touched her glass to Eliza's. "And to the truth," she added quietly, "however long delayed, however painful, the truth is always preferable to illusion." That night, after her guests had gone to bed, Catherine sat at her desk and began writing again. Not her usual fiction this time, but a letter addressed to the young woman who had stood in a wedding dress 41 years earlier, waiting for a man who would never arrive. In it, she detailed everything she wished someone could have told her then, about resilience, about reinvention, about the life waiting beyond devastation. "Dearest Catherine," she wrote, "he will never come, but you will. You will arrive at yourself, at a life richer and more complex than the one you're mourning. The answers, when they finally come, won't provide the catharsis you imagine. But by then, you won't need catharsis anymore. You'll have built something stronger than the story you thought was yours. The man who left today has done you a terrible injury, but he has also unwittingly set you free. Free to become someone beyond definition by relationship, beyond the conventional paths you've been following without question. The journey will be painful, excruciating at times, but you will not walk it alone. And the woman who emerges will be extraordinary in ways you cannot yet imagine. It is too late for the life you planned. It will always be too late for that. But it is precisely the right time for the life you haven't yet discovered, the one waiting beyond this moment of absolute despair. Trust that woman, the one you will become. She knows the way forward, even now. Catherine sealed the letter in an envelope and placed it in the manuscript box that would go to her publisher the following week. Her final book, a collection of essays on resilience and reinvention. This letter would never be published, but the act of writing it completed a circle 4 decades in the making. In her dreams that night, Catherine stood not at the altar, but at a crossroads. In one direction she could see the life that might have been with James. Children, grandchildren, the Mitchell family home filled with light and laughter. In the other direction stretched the life she had actually lived, solitary but rich, marked by profound friendships, meaningful work, quiet mornings with the sea. Both paths held beauty. Both held pain. Neither was perfect. Neither was wrong. Catherine woke with the understanding that had eluded her for so many years. James hadn't robbed her of the better life, merely a different one. And in his absence, she had constructed something uniquely her own, a life defined not by who had left, but by who had remained, by who she had become in the space where waiting ended and living truly began. It was autumn when Catherine's final book was published. Reviews called it a masterwork of resilience and a roadmap through heartbreak to wisdom. She gave a single interview to a literary journal that had supported her work from the beginning. When asked what had inspired this culminating examination of loss and reinvention, Catherine smiled. "Life rarely gives us the endings we expect," she said. "The real story isn't in the dramatic moments of abandonment or revelation, though those make for compelling narratives. The real story is in what happens after, in the quiet, unglamorous work of rebuilding, day by day, in learning that closure isn't something granted to us by others, but something we create for ourselves." The interviewer, sensing deeper currents, asked if there was a personal experience informing this perspective. Catherine looked out the window at the maple trees beginning to turn scarlet and gold. "There was a day," she said carefully, "when everything I thought I knew about my life was revealed to be incomplete. Not false exactly, but fundamentally insufficient. I had built an entire identity around a particular understanding of the past. When that understanding changed, I had to decide, would I cling to the familiar narrative, or would I be brave enough to incorporate this new truth, however painful?" "And which did you choose?" the interviewer prompted. "The harder path," Catherine said simply. "The truth, always the truth, however late it arrives, however much it costs. Because living authentically in the present requires seeing the past clearly, even when that clarity brings pain." That winter, Catherine's health began to decline. Nothing dramatic, she had always been robust, but a gradual diminishment that she recognized as the beginning of her final chapter. She faced this transition with the same clear-eyed acceptance she had eventually brought to every aspect of her life. Eliza visited regularly, often bringing her daughter. They would sit in Catherine's sunroom, overlooking the winter sea, sharing stories that connected their separate experiences of the same elusive man. It was a curious kind of healing, this friendship built on shared absence, on the negative space left by James's choices. "What do you think happens," Eliza asked during one such visit, "when we die? Do you think we meet again the people who shaped our lives?" Catherine considered the waves crashing against the shore. "I don't know. But if so, I hope we meet them as they truly were, not as we imagined them to be. And I hope we meet them with the wisdom we've gained in their absence." In April 2024, 42 years after standing at an altar waiting for a man who never arrived, Catherine Ferguson died peacefully in her sleep. Her small cottage was filled with books, photographs, letters from readers whose lives had been touched by her words. The emerald ring remained buried beneath the oak tree, now growing strong and tall, its roots holding secrets the world would never fully know. Her memorial service was held in the same church where she had once waited in a wedding dress. The symmetry was not lost on the attendees, friends, former students, readers who had found solace in her work. Eliza spoke briefly, sharing not the story of her father's deception, but of Catherine's extraordinary resilience, her capacity for reinvention, her insistence on living fully despite profound betrayal. "She taught me," Eliza concluded, "that our stories don't end with abandonment or revelation. They continue, they evolve, they transform. The question isn't what happened to us, but what we choose to create from those circumstances." As attendees filed out afterward, many noticed a curious thing. On the church steps, where a bride had once waited anxiously for news of her missing groom, someone had placed a single white rose. Beside it lay a handwritten note that read simply, "It is never too late for truth. It is never too late for peace." No one knew who left these items. Perhaps a reader touched by Catherine's work. Perhaps Eliza, honoring both the woman who had become an unexpected friend and the father whose absence had connected them. Perhaps even the ghost of James himself, making one final gesture toward the redemption that had eluded him in life. Or perhaps it doesn't matter. Perhaps what matters is only this, that a story that began with absence ended with presence, that a life interrupted by betrayal concluded in wholeness, that a woman who waited 40 years for answers finally discovered the most important truth of all, that the answers were never what she needed. What she needed was exactly what she had created for herself. A life of meaning, of connection, of authenticity, hard-won through confrontation with painful truths. It was not the story either of them had planned that June day in 1982. It was both smaller and vastly larger than the conventional happiness they had envisioned. It contained more pain than they could have imagined, but also more wisdom, more depth, more truth. In the end, it was not a story about a groom who vanished, but about a woman who appeared, who emerged from the chrysalis of abandonment transformed, not into someone perfect or unscathed, but into someone real, someone who understood that life's most profound lessons often arrive disguised as its greatest disappointments. And perhaps that understanding is the only closure we can ever truly hope for. Not the fairy tale ending, not the dramatic revelation, not even the long-delayed apology, but the quiet wisdom that comes from surviving the unthinkable and discovering that survival itself is a kind of triumph. It was too late for the life they had planned. It was too late for redemption, for reunion, for the conventional happy ending. But it was exactly the right time for the truth, for acceptance, for peace. And in that acceptance, that hard-won peace, Catherine Ferguson, the bride who waited, the woman who survived, the writer who transformed personal catastrophe into universal wisdom, finally found the closure that had eluded her for 42 years. Not in answers, but in the realization that the answers had never been the point. The point was the life she had built in their absence, the story she had written for herself, the truth she had faced, however belatedly it arrived. And in the end, that was enough. It had always been enough. Days after Catherine's funeral, Eliza returned to the cottage to begin the process of sorting through belongings. The task felt both intrusive and necessary, a final act of care for the woman who had become an unexpected friend in the twilight of her life. Among Catherine's papers, Eliza found a sealed envelope addressed to her. Inside was a letter and a key. Eliza, if you're reading this, I've moved on to whatever comes next. Thank you for the gift of your friendship these past months. In knowing you, I've glimpsed pieces of a parallel life, the one where your father and I built something together. It's strange how the universe sometimes offers these sideways glances at roads not taken. The enclosed key opens a safe deposit box at First Coast Bank. Inside, you'll find manuscripts I never published, stories too personal, too raw for public consumption. Among them is the complete account of my relationship with your father, from our first meeting to our final, indirect communication through you. These stories belong to you now. Not to publish, they weren't written for that, but to understand. They represent the third side of a triangle, your father's truth, your understanding of him, and now my experience. Whatever you choose to do with them, know this. Meeting you was an unexpected grace in my life. You helped me complete a circle that remained open for 40 years. For that, I am eternally grateful. With deepest affection, Catherine. Eliza sat on Catherine's porch, watching the same ocean view that had comforted the older woman in her final years. The letter trembled in her hands, another piece in the complex puzzle of her father's life, of Catherine's resilience, of her own inherited legacy of secrets. The next morning, Eliza visited First Coast Bank. The safe deposit box contained several leather-bound journals and a manuscript titled simply The Spaces Between. As Catherine had indicated, these were deeply personal accounts, not just of the disappearance and its aftermath, but of Catherine's internal journey through abandonment, revelation, and eventually toward peace. One entry from 2005, 3 years after Catherine discovered the hidden journal in the Mitchell home, particularly struck Eliza. I dreamed of James last night, not as he was, but as he might be now. grey at the temples, lines around his eyes, that same intense gaze. In the dream, we sat across from each other at a cafe, somewhere European, perhaps Paris or Rome. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing to say after all this time. But there was a sense of mutual recognition, not just of each other's physical presence, but of the shared understanding that life is rarely what we plan, almost never what we expect. In the dream, I reached across the table and touched his hand briefly. Not in forgiveness, some things lie beyond forgiveness, but in acknowledgement. We existed together once. We shaped each other irreversibly. And then we lived completely separate lives, connected only by the invisible thread of shared history. I woke with tears on my face, but they weren't tears of grief or anger. They were tears of recognition, of seeing clearly, perhaps for the first time, that James's leaving wasn't the defining moment of my life, merely the catalyst for discovering who I truly was, beyond relationships, beyond expectations, beyond the conventional narratives we're taught to follow. Would I change what happened if I could? Once, the answer would have been an unequivocal yes. Now, at 54, I'm no longer certain. Without that particular shattering, would I have discovered the specific strength required to rebuild? Without that specific absence, would I have found the particular voice that has connected with so many readers? The woman standing at that altar in 1982 could never have imagined the life awaiting her. The pain, yes, but also the profound discovery of her own resilience. As Eliza continued reading through the journals, a more complete picture emerged of Catherine's evolution over 40 years. The early entries were raw with pain, desperate questions, rage, confusion. The middle years showed a woman determinedly building a new life while carrying the weight of unanswered questions. The later entries revealed someone who had transformed suffering into wisdom, absence into presence, abandonment into self-reliance. One passage from 2015 seemed particularly revealing. The irony doesn't escape me, that in running from commitment, from responsibility, from the future we had planned, James ultimately constrained his own life far more severely than staying might have. He lived forever in the shadow of his deception, forever separated from authenticity, forever constructing elaborate facades to hide his true identity. Meanwhile, I was forced into a painful authenticity, into confronting fundamental questions about identity and resilience. His flight became his prison. My abandonment became eventually a kind of liberation. For weeks, Eliza immersed herself in Catherine's writings, finding unexpected insights not just into Catherine and James, but into herself. There were patterns she recognized: her father's emotional distance, his periodic melancholy, his inability to fully engage with the present moment. Catherine had observed and articulated these same qualities decades earlier. One evening, sitting in her own home surrounded by Catherine's journals, Eliza made a decision. She would compile selections from Catherine's unpublished writings, not for public consumption, but as a private history for her own daughter. Someday, Lily would be old enough to understand the complicated legacy she had inherited, not just the genes and mannerisms of her grandfather, but the resilience and wisdom of the woman he had abandoned. Eliza created a leather-bound volume, interspersing Catherine's writings with photographs, letters, and her own observations. She titled it The Parallel Lives of Catherine Ferguson and James Mitchell, Richard Collins, a record of two people whose paths diverged dramatically that June day in 1982, yet remained invisibly connected across 40 years and thousands of miles. In the introduction, Eliza wrote, "This is not a conventional family history. There are no simple heroes or villains, no clear moral lessons, no tidy conclusions. Instead, there are human beings making choices, some courageous, some cowardly, some desperate, some deliberate, and living with the consequences of those choices across decades. My father chose flight over confrontation, deception over honesty, reinvention over authenticity. He paid for these choices with a lifetime of looking over his shoulder, of compartmentalizing his existence, of never fully inhabiting his own life. Catherine chose resilience over victimhood, truth-seeking over comfortable illusion, reinvention of her own kind. She paid for these choices with years of uncertainty, of painful questioning, of standing at the center of a local tragedy. But she emerged with something my father never found: genuine peace, authentic self-knowledge, the quiet dignity of a life lived on her own terms. I offer this history not as judgment, but as testament. We are all shaped by decisions made before our birth, by secrets kept and revealed, by the complex interplay of choice and circumstance. Understanding these forces doesn't change them, but it does allow us to recognize their influence, and perhaps to make our own choices with greater consciousness, greater compassion, greater courage. On what would have been Catherine and James's 43rd wedding anniversary, Eliza visited the church where her father had failed to appear, where Catherine had later been memorialized. She placed flowers at the steps, not white roses this time, but vibrant spring blooms in all their complex glory. Beside the flowers, she left a small framed photograph, Catherine and James in happier times, their young faces alight with possibilities neither could have anticipated. Beneath the image, she placed a card with lines from one of Catherine's poems: "What shatters us remakes us, though never as we were. The breaking is permanent, the healing incomplete, yet somehow sufficient." As Eliza turned to leave, she noticed an elderly man watching from a nearby bench. Something about his posture, the tilt of his head, the intensity of his gaze, reminded her of photographs she'd seen of her grandfather, Robert Mitchell. For a brief, impossible moment, she wondered if the family ghosts had materialized, if her father had somehow survived his documented death to witness this moment of commemoration. But when she looked again, the bench was empty, just another phantom. Another might have been in a story built on absences and apparitions. Later that summer, Eliza received an unexpected email from a woman named Claire Peterson, a former student of Catherine's who had become a documentary filmmaker. Claire was working on a project about people who reinvent themselves, those who change identities voluntarily, and those forced to rebuild after devastating loss. Professor Ferguson often spoke about resilience in her classes, Claire wrote. It wasn't until her final book was published that I understood how personally she had experienced that concept. I'd like to include her story in my documentary, not exploitatively, but as an example of how humans rebuild after fundamental ruptures in their expected narratives. Eliza considered the request carefully. Catherine had been private about her experience for decades, sharing it fully only in her final years. Yet her published work had touched countless readers precisely because it transformed personal pain into universal insight. Would including her story in this documentary honor that legacy or violate her privacy? After much reflection, Eliza agreed to an interview with specific conditions: no sensationalizing, no oversimplification, no villainizing of her father. Their story isn't about good versus evil, she explained to Claire. It's about choice and consequence, about how decisions ripple across decades, affecting not just the decision-makers, but everyone connected to them. The resulting documentary segment approached Catherine and James's story with nuance and complexity. It included interviews with Catherine's former colleagues and students, excerpts from her published works, and Eliza's careful narration of the events from 1982 through 2024. No photographs of James as Richard Collins were used, a boundary Eliza maintained firmly, protecting her father's other children from unwanted exposure to his hidden past. The documentary aired in early 2025, receiving thoughtful reviews that praised its exploration of identity and reinvention. One critic noted, "In an age of simplistic narratives and moral absolutism, the Architects of Identity offers something radical. The suggestion that human choices and their consequences exist in shades of grey rather than black and white. For Eliza, the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. Among the emails and messages that arrived after the documentary aired was one from a man named Thomas Mitchell, a cousin of James's, whom Eliza had never met, from the side of the family her father had abandoned, along with his identity. "I was 17 when James disappeared," Thomas wrote. "I remember the confusion, the search parties, the gradual loss of hope. Uncle Robert was never the same afterward. For years I've carried this unresolved family tragedy. Watching your segment in the documentary was like finally closing a circuit that had remained open for decades. Not healing, exactly. Too much time has passed for that. But completion, understanding. I don't know if I could ever forgive James for what his disappearance did to his parents, but seeing the whole picture helps me make sense of a family mystery that shaped my own youth. Thank you for your courage in sharing this complex story." Thomas's message led to correspondence, then to meeting in person. At 70, he carried the Mitchell family resemblance, the same intense gaze that had passed from Robert to James to Eliza herself. Over lunch at a quiet cafe, they shared stories from their parallel branches of a family tree, severed by deception, yet somehow still connected by blood and memory. "Do you think he was mentally ill?" Thomas asked at one point. "To plan such an elaborate disappearance, to abandon everyone who loved him." Eliza considered the question that had haunted her since discovering her father's true identity. "I don't think it's that simple," she finally answered. "From Catherine's journals and my own experience of him as Richard Collins, I believe he suffered from what we might now call depression, possibly anxiety. But many people manage those conditions without such drastic measures. I think what happened was a complex intersection of psychological distress, cultural expectations about masculinity and success, and fundamental character flaws, particularly a lifelong pattern of avoiding difficult confrontations." Thomas nodded slowly. The not knowing was the hardest part for Uncle Robert and Aunt Eleanor. If they had known he was alive somewhere, even if he wanted no contact, I think they could have found some peace. That's what Catherine eventually concluded as well," Eliza said, "that his greatest cruelty wasn't leaving, but leaving them in perpetual uncertainty." As they parted, Thomas handed Eliza a small package. "These belong to James's parents. I inherited them after Aunt Eleanor died. They should be yours now, and your daughter's eventually." Inside the package was a collection of Mitchell family photographs spanning generations, including several of James as a child and young man. Also enclosed was Robert Mitchell's pocket watch, engraved with the family motto, "Veritas omnia vincit." Truth conquers all. The irony of the motto wasn't lost on either of them. That evening, Eliza added these new items to the growing archive she was creating. The tangible remnants of parallel lives, of paths taken and abandoned, of truths revealed too late to change the past, but perhaps in time to illuminate the future. As she placed Robert's pocket watch beside Catherine's journals, Eliza reflected on the strange inheritance she had received. Not just genes and heirlooms, but patterns of behavior, unspoken fears, capacities for both deception and resilience. What would she pass on to her own daughter? Which legacies would she nurture? Which would she transform? Which would she allow to fade? In the spring of 2026, Eliza published a book that grew from her research into her father's double life and her friendship with Catherine. Titled The Architecture of Absence, it explored how people construct identities around significant losses, not just through death or disappearance, but through migration, estrangement, cultural displacement, and chosen reinvention. The book wasn't primarily about James and Catherine, though their story formed one chapter. Instead, it examined broader questions of how humans navigate rupture and continuity, how we integrate or compartmentalize our past selves, how we build meaning in the aftermath of profound disruption. In the acknowledgements, Eliza wrote, To Catherine Ferguson, who showed me that resilience isn't about returning to an unbroken state, but about creating something valuable from the experience of shattering. Your friendship in your final years was an unexpected gift that helped me understand not just my father, but myself. To James Mitchell, Richard Collins, my father in both his identities, your choices created ripples that continue to shape lives long after your departure. In studying the architecture of your absence, I've learned much about the structure of my own presence in the world. And to my daughter Lily, may you inherit the best of these complicated legacies, the creativity without the deception, the resilience without the shattering that necessitated it. May you build a life authentic to your truest self, with the courage to face difficult truths rather than flee from them. The book received thoughtful reviews, particularly from those interested in psychology, identity formation, and family systems. But for Eliza, the most meaningful response came from her daughter, now 12, who read the book with a maturity beyond her years. "So Grandpa was two different people," Lily said one evening as they walked along the same shoreline where Catherine had found solace in her final years. "And neither one was completely real?" "That's one way to look at it," Eliza acknowledged. "He compartmentalized his life so completely that neither identity could contain his whole truth." Lily considered this. "And Catherine, she was the opposite. She had to become more real because of what he did." Eliza smiled at her daughter's perceptiveness. "I think that's exactly right. His deception forced her into a painful authenticity. She had to rebuild herself from the foundation up. I think I'd rather be like her," Lily said decisively, "even if it hurts more at first." In that moment, Eliza glimpsed the future, her daughter carrying forward not the pattern of flight and deception that had defined her grandfather, but the resilience and authenticity that had ultimately defined Catherine. The legacy transforming, healing, evolving across generations. That autumn, Eliza visited the oak tree, where Catherine had buried the emerald ring. Now 5 years old, the tree was flourishing, its roots reaching deep into earth that held symbolic remains of both Catherine's shattered expectations and her hard-won peace. Eliza placed a small stone at its base. Not a grave marker, not a monument, but a simple acknowledgement of lives connected and separated, of paths chosen and abandoned, of truths revealed too late to change the past, but perhaps in time to shape the future. As she turned to leave, a sudden breeze scattered golden leaves around her feet. For a brief moment, Eliza felt surrounded by presences, her father in both his identities, Catherine in her solitary strength, all the ancestors whose choices had culminated in this precise moment, this exact configuration of circumstance and consciousness. It was too late for reunions, for reconciliations, for the neat resolutions found in simpler stories. It had always been too late, from the moment James Mitchell walked away from his own wedding, from his own name, from the responsibilities and connections that defined him. But it wasn't too late for understanding, for integration, for the complex peace that comes not from erasing painful truths, but from incorporating them into a more complete narrative. Eliza walked back toward her car, leaving the oak tree to continue its quiet growth, its roots entwined around an emerald ring, its branches reaching toward a future beyond personal memory, beyond individual choice, beyond the intricate architecture of presence and absence that had defined this particular story. In the years that followed, Eliza continued her work exploring identity, absence, and reinvention. Her research took her to communities affected by displacement, to individuals who had changed their identities for reasons ranging from survival to self-discovery, to families fragmented and reconstituted through choice and circumstance. Wherever she went, she carried the lessons learned from Catherine's journals, from her father's dual existence, from her own experience navigating the complex legacy of their intertwined stories. That identity is both more fragile and more resilient than we imagine. That absence shapes us as profoundly as presence, that the stories we tell about our lives are never just stories. They are the scaffolding upon which we build our understanding of self, of purpose, of meaning. That truth, however delayed, however painful, offers possibilities that deception forecloses. As Lily grew into adulthood, she too found herself drawn to questions of identity and authenticity, though from a different angle. A gifted artist, she created installations exploring the boundaries between presence and absence, visibility and invisibility, connection and separation. For her breakthrough exhibition in 2036, she created a piece titled The Empty Altar, a multimedia work combining architectural elements, projected text from Catherine's writings, and a soundscape featuring church bells, ocean waves, and fragments of her grandfather's voice extracted from old home videos from his life as Richard Collins. The piece received international attention for its emotional power and conceptual complexity. Critics noted its exploration of the architecture of absence, how empty spaces define structures as significantly as solid forms. The exhibition catalogue included an essay by Eliza, connecting the personal history that inspired the work to broader cultural patterns of disappearance and reinvention. On opening night, as viewers moved through the installation, Eliza stood slightly apart, watching her daughter navigate questions from critics and collectors. Lily handled the attention with a grounded presence that reminded Eliza powerfully of Catherine. The same quiet strength, the same refusal to simplify complex emotional truths for easier consumption. Later that evening, alone in her hotel room, Eliza wrote in her journal, "Watching Lily tonight, I saw the alchemy that happens across generations, how pain can transmute into wisdom, absence into creative presence, deception into a fierce commitment to truth. My father fled from himself, creating ripples of harm that extended far beyond his immediate circle. Catherine rebuilt herself from those same ripples, creating meaning that likewise extended beyond herself. And now, Lily takes these inherited patterns and transforms them again, not erasing the darkness, but integrating it into work that illuminates, that connects, that makes visible the invisible architectures shaping all our lives. It is too late for my father to know his granddaughter. Too late for Catherine to see how her resilience flowered in the next generation. Too late for the reconciliations and recognitions that might have brought a neater conclusion to their story. But perhaps it is precisely on time for this, for Lily's transformation of inherited absence into creative presence, for the alchemy that happens not despite our wounds but because of them. For in the spaces between presence and absence, truth and deception, connection and separation, that's where we all live, all build our imperfect essential identities. In the end, perhaps that's the only real truth, that we are all architects of identity, all navigating the complex interplay of what we choose to embrace and what we choose to escape. It is too late for some stories. It will always be too late. But new stories continue to emerge, shaped by but not limited to what came before. And in that continuation, that transformation, there is a kind of completion that transcends conventional closure. In 2042, 60 years after James Mitchell vanished from his own wedding, Eliza published a final book on the subject. Titled 60 Years of Aftermath, it traced the ripple effects of one man's decision to disappear through family systems, through creative expressions, through the increasingly complex understanding of identity in a digital age, where reinvention had become simultaneously more possible and more challenging. The book included contributions from various individuals affected by James's disappearance and Catherine's response to it, former students whose lives had been changed by her teaching and writing, descendants of the Mitchell family, researchers studying the psychology of identity fraud, Even other individuals who had chosen to disappear from their own lives, some of whom had read Catherine's work while constructing their new identities. In the epilogue, Eliza reflected, 60 years ago, a man walked away from his own wedding, his own name, his own history. In doing so, he created absence where presence had been promised. That absence became its own kind of presence, a ghost haunting multiple lives across decades, a negative space defining the structures built around it. Meanwhile, a woman stood waiting at an altar, her life suddenly and irrevocably altered by someone else's choice. In the face of abandonment, she eventually built something extraordinary, a life defined not by what was taken from her, but by what she created in the aftermath. Their parallel journeys never reconnected in life, yet remained invisibly entangled. The man who sought freedom through flight discovered its limitations. The woman forced into a painful liberation discovered its possibilities. Neither story is simple, neither offers easy moral lessons or tidy conclusions. What remains 60 years later is not just memory or legacy, but living questions. How do we integrate loss into meaningful identity? How do we balance the human drives for reinvention and authenticity? How do we construct lives of integrity when the foundations shift? Beneath us, perhaps the final wisdom is this: that every identity is both constructed and authentic, both chosen and inherited, both continuous and constantly in flux. The architect who disappeared and the woman who rebuilt herself were engaged in the same fundamental human project, making meaning from the raw materials of circumstance, choice, and consequence. It is too late for their particular stories to change. It will always be too late. But the larger story of how humans navigate rupture and continuity, how we build and rebuild identity throughout our lives, continues beyond individual endings. In that continuation, there is a completion that transcends conventional closure. Not the closing of a circle, but the recognition that circles continue expanding long after we can trace their full circumference. On the 60th anniversary of James's disappearance, Lily took her own daughter, Catherine, named for the woman whose resilience had shaped their family narrative, to visit the church where the story began. Now, a historical building rather than an active place of worship, it still maintained the same austere beauty, the same solemn atmosphere that had witnessed a bride's devastating realization 6 decades earlier. "This is where it started," Lily explained to 14-year-old Catherine, "where your great-grandfather made a choice that would shape all our lives, though none of us were yet born." Young Catherine, with the directness of adolescence, asked, "Do you think he ever regretted it?" Lily considered this question that had echoed across 3 generations. "I think regret is too simple a word for what he felt. From everything we know, from his letter to the original Catherine, from my mother's memories of him as Richard Collins, I think he lived with a complex awareness that his choice had both liberated and imprisoned him, that in fleeing one future, he had constrained himself in ways he never anticipated. And Catherine, the first one, was she happier because of what he did, or despite it? That's the question, isn't it?" Lily smiled at her daughter's perception. "I think eventually she came to understand that happiness wasn't the point, at least not the simple, uncomplicated happiness she had expected as a young bride. What she found instead was a deeper kind of satisfaction, in creative work, in meaningful connections, in hard-won wisdom." As they left the church, Catherine paused on the steps where a bride had once waited in growing panic, where mourners had later gathered to celebrate a life built from abandonment, where Eliza had placed flowers and photographs to honor parallel lives that never reconnected. "It's strange," the teenager said thoughtfully, "how one person's biggest mistake became the reason for so much everything else. Would any of us even exist if he hadn't run away?" Lily put her arm around her daughter's shoulders. "That's the mystery, isn't it? We can trace the patterns backward, see how each choice led to the next moment, the next connection. But we can never know the alternate paths, the lives that might have unfolded if different choices had been made. I think I'm glad it happened this way, Catherine decided, not because it was good, it wasn't, but because we're here, and the story isn't over. As they walked away from the church, the late afternoon sun cast their shadows long behind them. 3 generations of women carrying forward a legacy crafted from absence and presence, from flight and resilience, from truths revealed too late to change the past, but just in time to illuminate the future. It was too late for some stories. It would always be too late. But never too late for others to begin.